I'm very glad to have the opportunity tonight to speak to you about this quite remarkable woman whom you can see up there. This is at a Melbourne school, and she's watching kids playing, some boys playing marbles. That is a very typical look of Dorothy Howard at the time. Neat, small, neat, in a suit. You often saw her with a hat and gloves. She looks like the conventional middle-aged, middle-class woman, and she was middle-aged and she was middle-class, but she was certainly not conventional. She was a radical spirit, both, I think, in her life, in her attitude to things like politics and the environment and such like, but also very significantly in what I'm going to talk about in her, what you might call her professional and scholarly life. It's interesting to be giving this lecture in the Key Thinkers series, because the thing that we were told when we were invited was that it was to be an hour-long talk on an internationally well-known thinker whose work has inspired your own. Well, the latter part is certainly true. Dorothy Howard's work has both inspired and enriched my own work, but it isn't true that she is an internationally well-known thinker. But one of my perhaps evangelical intents is to make her rather better known, and I hope tonight will at least achieve that in some small way. And I should also point out that her field of scholarship, or both her fields of scholarship, are not areas which are very highly regarded, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And of course she is a woman. And I did a quick count, and it is interesting, although not surprising, that of the 24 key speakers that this admirable series that the university has invented this year, only 4 of the subjects are women. So that tells you a little bit about history, and it tells you a little about perception. Well, a key thinker, what is a key thinker? Someone who opens what's the key? It opens a locked door. And more metaphorically, it seems to me, it makes visible and known something that is hitherto unknown or not well understood. It explores some area of critical significance, something that enables us to think about the world differently and often proceed in the world differently. And Dorothy Howard was, while a genuinely scholarly thinker, was very much a practical woman who wanted her ideas put into practice in the world. She's born in 1902 in a place called Sabine Bottom, which is on the southwestern border of Texas, I think, to a very small rural community where her father teaches school. And she has written a very interesting and rather unusual autobiography called Dorothy's World, Childhood in Sabine Bottom, it's hard to say that, 1902 to 1910, where she refers to herself in the third person. But once you get over that oddity, it is a remarkable recounting of the first 8 years of a small girl's life in that time, in the family, in the culture and community, and there's a whole fat section in the book about her play life. A very uncommon thing for autobiographers to do. You usually get things about, whether their mothers were nice to them and poverty or wealth or whatever, but you very rarely get in autobiographies, not entirely never, but rarely, aspects of the children's own lives among themselves. And that's one of the things that Dorothy does provide. She takes a 4-year bachelor degree at what was then called the North Texas State Teachers College in Denton in Texas, which is now the North Texas University, and she graduates in 1923. There's Dorothy, young woman, wearing, the top knot thing you wear, the board, in her graduation. And she goes on to teach in New York and in New Jersey for up until about 1944. She's involved in teaching. That's primary school teaching, what they call elementary school teaching in the United States. And it's during her teaching in a school not unlike that, I would imagine, although this photo is a little earlier than the 30s, which is her main beginnings time. She has her, what you might call her eureka moment. And it's because she is teaching large numbers of immigrant children. Children who are the children of refugees from growing fascism in Europe, children from West Indies, children from various parts of Europe, all of whom don't have English as mother tongue. And she, I think, was a perfectionist and certainly was self-critical. And she says, and I might just read you this little description. My pupils were cooperative and patient with me, but after 2 months I knew I was a failure. Then one day at noontime, feeling complete frustration, I stood at an open classroom window looking down on the unsupervised playground. Oh, the days of unsupervised playgrounds. That's me, not her. Balls were bouncing, ropes were turning, marbles were rolling, and the little ones were chasing each other in tag games. I first became aware that they were playing the same games I had played in my childhood on a farm in East Texas. And as I listened, I heard to my surprise that they were all speaking English. Some of what I heard was familiar play language from my own childhood. She gives some examples. My frustration changed to fascination and wonder. Were these children learning English from each other on the playground faster than from their textbooks and from me in the classroom? Snatching a pencil and a notebook from my desk, I wrote several verses I had heard. And by the time the bell rang bringing the children into the classroom, I had printed 2 or 3 of those verses on the blackboard. And so began a hitherto unplanned and unexpected, a very inventive, as it turns out, beginning to a long, fruitful and most unconventional career, in which, though she doesn't know it yet, her passion for education is linked with her growing interest and understanding of the folklore of childhood. And that's something she wrote, of course, much later. I began to view the playground as an educational institution, a subculture, a world existing 3 feet below the eye level of myopic adults. And what she did then, right through the 30s and into the 40s, was to build her literacy and literature teaching, and indeed in many ways, many aspects of her curriculum, around the oral tradition of childhood. And these are just some of the examples of the things that she was using as the material for reading and writing and talking and discussion. I asked my mother for 50 cents to see the elephant jump the fence. He jumped so high he reached the sky and never came back from the 4th of July. And there's roll, roll. This is, of course, a marbles chant. Roll, roll, tootsie roll, roll the marble in the hole. A sort of little imprecation before you actually do the deed. Meant to bring you luck, I think. What she was doing was, in fact, unprecedented. She was taking the informal, non-written down, oral play law of children, and she was elevating it to become the core of her curriculum. It didn't come in books, it came out of the mouths and the actions of the children in her classes. So they provided the substantial material on which the learning took place. And she didn't, as so many people at the time commonly did, just view this folklore, this verbal and kinetic folklore, as relics of antique societies left over from adult culture. She recognised very early that this was in fact children's own culture, a kind of massive subculture made up of thousands of little subcultures, if we can go that far, of a game here, a rhyme there, a chant there, an insult there, a secret language, and a constantly shifting and moving arrangement of children playing with one group and then maybe not falling out and playing with someone else and so on. It's quite a complex world that she begins to examine. And there she is as a more mature woman in that period where she's beginning to develop this program, of which there were no books she could apply to. There was no one else who could guide her. So she was in many ways really quite like a scientist. She tried something out. If it worked, she went on with it. If it didn't, she tried to find out why or adapted it. There were, of course, earlier pioneers in some aspects of what she was doing in education. Of course, Maria Montessori, for example, in an earlier period, although an overlapping period in some ways, had emphasised that children can learn without adult direction and that the teacher must observe what children themselves do and what their interests are in order to advance their education. And this certainly corresponded with Dorothy's method, although it did not, of course, correspond with the substance of what she was doing. And similarly, the profoundly influential American educator John Dewey, who argued so passionately and eloquently about the nature of education being built on pillars of democracy and shared experience. That fitted very well with Dorothy Howard's work, but it had nothing whatever to do with the content of her work. In fact, I was thinking about who did she resemble, and the only one that I can think of is a much later educator, Paulo Freire, who was a significant reformer in education, and he put down that edict that the teacher should be the learner and the learner the teacher, and that education is a social and a collaborative activity. And that is actually the practice that Howard engaged in. Now, one of the interesting outcomes of what she was doing is that by exploring and engaging in this play culture of children, she actually, though not initially, I think intentionally, although later she was very conscious of what she had done, she was subverting the very strong, traditional and enduring relationship that normally existed and in many essential senses still exists between teacher and student. That relationship is between ruler and ruled. It's the relationship between the carrier of knowledge and the receiver of knowledge. The old Roman notion of tabula rasa, of the student as an empty sort of blackboard on which the teacher writes, was widely held at the time, and while it has been discarded as a theory, it is still available in practice in any school you'd like, well, not in any school, but in a number of schools you might visit today. So in this sort of classroom, and that is an American classroom of the period, with a teacher in front, and though this is an exhibition of some kind, it's done in very orderly, teacher-arranged fashion. She is doing something that she's, in a sense, honouring, and as well, when she recognises the skill and capacities of the children and their knowledge. And she says later, "I learned how to let the children teach each other as they did on the playground." And the truth is, they were also teaching her. And she was happy, indeed eager, to learn from them. So she is a pioneer in this very unusual process in education. And though she didn't know it at the time, she's also stumbling into another field. And the word folklore was quite unknown to her, but she is entering the field of folklore, in this case the folklore of children. And in a postscript that she wrote to her doctoral thesis, I'll mention the thesis later, which she wrote in 1990, and the doctoral thesis was 1938. So this is a very interesting late postscript to explain the context of her thesis. She wrote this: sometime in 1931, by accident, Dr. Walker Barnes, professor of English at New York University, heard about my collection and use of children's play lore. At a cocktail party, my sister, in casual conversation with Dr. Barnes, told him about my project. He sent me an invitation to drop by his office the next time I was in the city to tell him more. I accepted the invitation, and in that 2-hour visit, he introduced me to the word folklore, a new word in my vocabulary, and to the work of Alice Birth Gone, James Orchard, Halliwell, Strutt, Norval, and she lists a name. My secondary research, she says, began immediately. Like so much that is most interesting in our lives, or certainly in my life, and I guess in most of yours, things happen by chance. And it was the chance that her sister at a cocktail party, of all unlikely events, meets a rather unusual professor who guides her through the very sticky channels. Can you have sticky channels? Well, very awkward channels of the New York University's doctoral program. And she faces, and that's another pioneer effort, because as far as I can tell, her doctorate is the first doctorate in the English-speaking world on this subject of children's folklore that I've ever heard of or come across. But the Dean's Committee, which oversaw all the doctoral students at the university, could not believe that anybody was seriously going to write a doctoral thesis on something as trivial and insignificant as an aspect of children's folklore. This is the title of her thesis, Folk Jingles of American Children, a collection and study of rhymes used by children today. The very word jingle tells you something about the language that was available to her at the time to describe this material. But Dr. Barnes was a doughty supporter, and he guided her through this process, and he had a very interesting comment to her, because she must have complained, I think, on occasion. But as well as telling you about her intellectual toughness and resilience, it tells you something interesting about him. He said, "Get your degree and then do what you want for the rest of your life." And it's probably a good motto that any one of you who are planning to do a doctorate might, put over your desk. Get your degree and then do what you want for the rest of your life. And of course she did. That is exactly what she did. Quantities of reading. She became knowledgeable about the history of folklore and the history of children's folklore in particular. She attends lectures. Remember, she's a contemporary of Margaret Mead, France Boas, Ruth Benedict. She attends lectures at New York University. She goes over to the New School of Social Research to hear people like Claude Lévi-Strauss. She's reading very widely in a range of disciplines. She's building up an intellectual storehouse of knowledge and of understanding. But what is interesting about her is that most of the people who precede her, or who indeed come after her in the area of an interest in children's folklore, have never consider it as an applied science, if you like. It is something to collect, to examine, to be interested in, to write about, to speculate on the nature of childhood, of child development, on the human development. After all, there wasn't, at that time, the majority view was that folklore in itself was a sort of antiquarian discipline, and children after all were young savages, so you could study them just as you might study the savages in a desert, in an island somewhere where the anthropologists went. And she is working all through this material, but she does not end up taking that view at all. And by the time she becomes an academic, she becomes the chair of the English department at what was then called Frostburg State Teachers College. It's now the University of Maryland. She has a mature, scholarly understanding of the characteristics of children's folklore. And I just want to run through a few of them. Universality. This is one of the most remarkable characteristics. There does not seem to have been a society, nor is there one now, where children are not engaged in a subculture of their own or subcultures of their own. And this is an example of Aboriginal children from one of Donald Thompson's great photographs, playing what they call the honey game. A wire car made by a boy from Zimbabwe. You know, I could have spent the rest of the evening showing you wonderful pictures of this, but the universality was something that was impossible at first to believe, that it wasn't entirely culturally created by the particular culture in which a child lives, which of course is profoundly significant. And of course it's very old. Sorry, that was just another one from that's an American street in the 1940s or 50s, where while there are cars parked, it seems that children have the right to play in a way we don't any longer. That is that comes from southern Italy in about 340 BC, and what they're doing is playing jacks, knuckle bones, 5 stones, as it was called. And of course, many of you will know Bruegel's great painting of 1560, which we now call Children's Games. He didn't actually give it a name, in which there are more than 80 games, almost all of which are still now played by children around the world, including in Australia. And it has another of its characteristics, paradoxically, but then I heard a scientist the other day saying that the world is built around contradictions. And here's a great one. The contradiction or the paradox of the commonality of this experience and its endless variation. That's a little bit from the Bruegel, where they're playing jacks. There are 2 boys in a Brisbane school in the late 1970s. Every bit of that school was asphalted, so they played their marbles on the top of a manhole cover, which at least had some dints in it. And it is a sociable and collaborative operation. Its underpinnings are sociable and collaborative. And children, while they've never heard of this, understand the law of uneven development. That is, you can play with children who are not as skillful as you, and not so skillful. It's not at all like sport. And this is an example from a school in inner suburban Melbourne in the 1980s, a game of elastics. And a group of girls, I forget, eastern suburbs, I think, in the 90s, playing a clapping singing game. You do it together with others. Play is a sociable and a collaborative activity, even when it is a competitive activity, such as marbles. There's a lot of humour, parody and taboo breaking. This actually comes from Dorothy Howard's 1938 thesis. Then this is from an Australian version, of course, which you sing, God save our gracious cat, feed her on bread and fat, God save the cat, Keep her from harm and traps, don't give her any raps, long to reign over us. God Save the Queen. Of course, contemporary children would be a bit puzzled by that one, as God Save the Queen has departed from the Australian repertoire. And there is taboo breaking. My daddy lies over the ocean. You can sing this one too. My daddy lies over the sea. My daddy lies over my mummy. And that's how they got little me. And the very interesting thing is that this is a form of performance. A lot of children's play is a form of performance. It's what one commentator referred to as a shared aesthetic, in this case of language. And children are constantly mimicking and mocking adults. And in an article she wrote in the New Yorker, which was published in 1937, this is a year before she actually finishes that thesis and gets the degree. She wrote this: "The child, the most indefatigable of jokers, finds all experience an occasion for humour. The whole spectacle of the world is comic. Specifically, he finds risible all physical peculiarities, such as fat or ugliness, all offensive smells, sounds and actions, and love and intoxication and wounds and contusions. His art fulfills the definition of art as a criticism of life, for he regards adults' experience coldly, transfers it into concepts meaningful to himself, and states them in satirical and critical terms. He is a master of the change of pace, the shift of mood, the juxtaposition of pathos and bathos, which is the humorist's most serviceable device." And in her thesis, she wrote, and this is 1938, when serious adult folklorists like Cecil Sharp in England were keeping the vulgar and erotic material they were collecting from adults in a secret little hoard because they were not available to be published. She wrote this: "There are certain words which nice people, in inverted commas, do not say, such as belly, stink, ass, bull, spit, breeches, bell, and damn. There are certain things which nice people do not mention, such as garter, underpants, underwear, corset string, nightie. There are certain ideas about which nice people do not think, excretory processes, exposure of certain parts of the body, odours of the body, pregnancy. Some of these taboos are close kin to ancient taboos about sex. Some are religious taboos. All are flaunted in the rhymes of children." I think that Dean's committee, which was worried in the beginning about triviality, may have been worried much more seriously later about something they would have seen much more worrying.